back in the day when I started this YouTube channel, I started by doing a week-long So You Want to Be a Dice Maker dice making tutorial for beginners wanting to get started in resin cast polyhedral dice making. One of the videos I posted in that series was all about sanding and polishing your first set, and I showed you a really great beginner method to do that. Well, today I'm back with a more advanced method for polishing. So I'm not putting this as part of the Dice Making 101 series. We'll call this, I don't know, intermediate dice making. But I recently discovered that there is a whole sect of dice makers that don't use Zona papers at all to polish their dice, and they just use wet sanding with various grits of sandpaper. And I wanted to try it out because it seems like it is ever so slightly less work than I'm doing now, but you know, a little bit less work is always great when you work nonstop. But also, apparently this method is supposed to be better at removing micro scratches. So that's the biggest reason I really wanted to try this out, because I do still struggle with micro scratches. So, here's what you need. 1,000 grit wet dry sandpaper. 2,000 grit wet dry sandpaper. Do you see where this is going? 3,000 grit wet dry sandpaper. This is what you need. And a Dremel tool. Doesn't have to be the Dremel brand. And polishing paste, which I don't have available to show you, but polishing paste. There's a bunch of options you can use. I will tag some in the description below, and you can always find them in my Amazon storefront if you just want a quick place to go look at materials. So that's what you need. I always recommend the wool polishing bit for your Dremel. I will show you in the video what I'm talking about. I will make sure it is linked in the description below, and I will also make sure that it's in that Amazon storefront so you can check it out. But that is all you're going to need to do this. When I Dremel polish, I also do wear a respirator, but a dust mask would be fine because it's not about chemicals. I also like to wear gloves when I am sanding because, again, resin can get on your skin and can cause problems with resin down the line. So just your nitrile gloves that you already use for casting and a little cup of water. And I'm going to try this method for the very first time on YouTube with you all, and we can see if it makes the dice nice and shiny. Let's get into it. To get started with this dice polishing method, you're going to want to start by using a glass cutting board or top of a picture frame or just something glass. I prefer to use a tempered glass cutting board, and I'm going to line up all three of my wet dry sandpapers all in a row. You're also going to want an X-Acto knife and a cup of water, as well as the dice that you are obviously polishing. Now, I like to line my sandpaper up left to right from the lowest grit to the highest grit. It just helps me keep things straight. And then here you see me going to the rough edges where the cap of my mold touches the dice, and I'm just going to clean up any jagged edges depending on how old your mold is and various ways your mold was made. This may not be a very involved process for you, but my mold is a little bit older, so I did have some rough edges to kind of clean off. Basically, you just want to make everything level. Then I start by dipping my dice into my cup of water, and I just do very slow circles on the lowest grit of sandpaper. I normally start by counting around 40 circles before I then take a look at my dice and see how much more I need to do, because every single die is going to be different. But here, do you see that shiny spot at the bottom of the 7 face? That indicates that this side is not finished yet. You want the entire dice face to be matte with no shine left over, and that's how you know you're ready to move on to the next sandpaper. So I did about another 20 or so circles and checked the dice again. There is still a little tiny bit, so I went back and just did a couple more circles. You're not going to want to do too many because you don't want to over sand your dice, so checking it frequently is really important here. You may have noticed on my final check that there was a teeny little bit of shine left at the very bottom of that 7 face, but I've decided that's good enough. I don't want to oversand this, so I've moved on to the 1 face. On this particular die, I am only polishing 4 sides. The 7, the 1, the 19, and the 13, and that's because those are the 4 sides that were touching the lid of my mold, and they therefore have the roughest edges and actually need some work. If my mold were a little bit more beat up, or if there had been any issues with my master, or even just a scratch on my mold, I may be needing to polish more faces. But even though this mold is on the older side, it is actually in really great shape, and I'm still getting a really beautiful shine on all of the other dice faces, so I don't need to do any additional work in that regard. So here I am moving on again to the very next face. As you can see, I dip it in water between every face. Although sometimes I do realize that my sandpaper is too wet, and I will then either stop dipping it in water, or depending on how much water I've used, I do sometimes have to wipe some of it off the sandpaper. Here I am finishing up the 13 face, and you may not have been able to tell from that clip, but there was a tiny little indentation on the 13 face. It is just slightly lower than the rest of the faces on this die, which means I am not going to be able to get this perfectly smooth. This is a mark from the mold. It does happen. You may hear dice makers refer to it as a maker's mark. And it's just one of those signs that it's handmade. It doesn't always happen, but when it does, you really can only polish as well as you can polish. And the part that is just a little bit lower than the rest of the die, you just kind of have to leave. I think you'll find when this is all polished up, though, that it's barely noticeable. This one was really, really mild. I have now moved on to the second grit, and in this case, I do still check the dice in between 30 or 40 circles or so, but it is harder to tell just by looking at it if I'm done. So on the second and third grits of sandpaper, I actually just kind of count and try to be consistent with all of the faces. So on this grit of sandpaper, I'm actually doing about 40 rotations before moving on to the next face. And again, I'm just going to do that on all four sides before I am ready to move on to my highest grit, the 3000 grit, which is where we're hopefully going to get out the rest of the micro scratches and get this sucker ready to be polished by my Dremel. At this point, I think you've seen enough of my process on this, so I am going to speed up the rest of this grit until we get to the 3000 grit, just to move things along in this video for you. I don't want you to get bored. I just want to make sure that you see what I'm doing. So I did a lot of that at standard speed. Now, moving on to the third grit, I'm just shifting my sandpaper over a little bit, and I'm moving my cup of water to the other side. This is mostly because I realized you could see my ring light in the reflection, and it was bugging me. So I apologize if it was bugging all of you. Now, for this one, same deal as the 2000 grit. I just count how many circles I do, and I do more on my last grit. I will traditionally do between 50 and 60. I believe on this die I was doing 60 circles on all four of those faces, just to really try to make sure that I could remove all of the micro scratches and get this dice ready for a beautiful polish from the Dremel. Once again, we're going to go ahead and speed this up to get to the finish line. I also want to point out that while I know it's hard to tell by looking at these close-ups of the die, you can see that progress is being made when you're actually looking at the dice with your own eyes. It's a lot harder on the camera, but you can definitely see a reduction in micro scratches, and that's kind of what I'm looking at and trying to let you all see. But I do recognize that it's very difficult to see it on the camera, so if you're not really seeing anything in between all of these rotations every time I show you those close-ups, don't fret. It's pretty common. The camera makes it much harder to sort of catch all the nuances in the dice. Moving right along to my Dremel setup, I use 3M polishing paste when I Dremel polish. I just think it gives the best shine, but it does contain kerosene, so I'm using gloves, I am using a respirator, and this is the polishing tip that I recommend using. I have linked this item in the description of the video. It can also be found in my Amazon storefront, but if you just want to search for it, it is called a cotton polishing wheel, shank mounted, soft wool, fine buffing wheel. Using just some of those words may be enough to find this product, but it's a very soft, fluffy polishing tip that is going to get shorter and denser as you use it, so you will eventually have to replace it or risk damaging the die. But I have found this works the best for polishing, and it also has the least chance of anything else that I've used in actually damaging your die. Because yes, you can damage your die with a Dremel, which is why it's also very important to go as slow as you can, given the speed of the tool you're working with, and really take your time, trying very hard to stay within the lines of the dice face you are working on. And as you can see here in real time, this dice is polishing up so beautifully. I mean, look at this. This is not sped up at all. This is real time. It is just maybe 2 minutes of work to get this beautiful finish. I was so impressed with this method when I first tried it. I honestly couldn't believe it worked this well. I now get to use one less type of sandpaper or Zona paper when sanding. I used to have to use 4 things. Now I only have to use 3. And honestly, I love using my Dremel anyway. For those of you who are makers currently and you like to use a rock tumbler for polishing your dice, that will also work with this method. Just instead of the Dremel, go ahead and toss your die or your dice into your vibratory tumbler and you should be able to achieve the same shine. I will probably use my tumbler for my smaller dice, but I do really like this method for my chunks. As I said, I'm pretty comfortable using my Dremel anyway, and I love the instant satisfaction that you get. Look at this gorgeous die all inked up. I was so impressed with this method, and if you all try it, please leave me a comment and let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you enjoyed this video, please click like so I know to make more videos like this for you in the future. If you want to see more videos like this, please click subscribe and you can keep up with all of my dice making content. Thank you so much for watching. I will be back soon with another dice making tutorial.